On a scorching Sunday afternoon, June 25, 1876, we, the 7th Cavalry soldiers, stood at the edge of a sprawling, rugged expanse, moving westward toward the Little Big Horn. The air was thick with apprehension as our column threaded its way through the hills, each man fully aware of the monumental task ahead. Lieutenant Cook's directives were explicit. The regiment was to advance in separate groups, spreading across the difficult terrain to locate and confront the Sioux and Cheyenne forces reportedly gathered in the valley. With determination and a strong sense of duty, we pressed onward, though an unsettling feeling crept through the ranks, a foreboding that the day might hold unexpected dangers. We had no way of knowing just how intense and relentless the coming battle would prove to be. As we progressed, the oppressive midday heat bore down, and the column came to an abrupt halt. Shortly afterward, Lieutenant Cook arrived with instructions for Bentine to take Company H and head into the rugged hills to the left. Accompanying him were Company D, commanded by Captain Weir, and Company K, led by Lieutenant Godfrey, tasked with scouting and confronting any hostile forces. At the time, the full strategy was unclear to me, but I later learned that General Custer had retained direct command of Companies I, F, C, E, and L. Major Reno led a battalion composed of Companies M, A, and G, along with the majority of the Indian scouts, under Lieutenants Varnum and Hare. Major Reno was also joined by scouts Charlie Reynolds, Herndon, and the interpreter Frank Gerard, though it's possible this actually referred to Fred Gerard. Gruard, a scout attached to Crook's forces, had participated in the Battle of the Rosebud just 8 days earlier and may not have been present at Little Bighorn. Captain McDougall with Company B managed the rear guard and the pack escort, which Lieutenant Matthey supervised, drawing 6 men and a corporal from each of the 12 troops. Combined with the civilian packers, the pack train boasted over 130 armed men. Here was the 7th Cavalry, roughly 600 men in total, divided into 4 groups, advancing into remote, rolling, mountainous terrain in search of Indian forces. We knew that about 12 to 15 miles west lay a substantial gathering of hostiles, yet had little precise knowledge of their numbers or intentions. It seemed our experienced scouts and guides suspected several thousand hostile warriors awaited us, but I believe Custer and most officers estimated a force of between 1,000 and 1,500 warriors, expecting them to be poorly equipped and loosely organized. Based on past encounters, they anticipated a mere rear-guard skirmish, with the primary aim of letting women, children, elders, and ponies escape. In reality, however, our 600 soldiers would soon confront nearly double our own numbers, with Reno's spearheading command facing odds as steep as 15 to 1. It appears Custer originally intended to remain hidden in a ravine we reached around 10 that morning, aiming to launch an attack at dawn on the 26th, aligning with Terry's broader strategy to encircle the Indians. However, upon realizing hostile scouts had spotted our column, he saw no choice but to attack immediately, hoping to strike before they could scatter. It's likely Custer's decision to send Bentine and the 3 companies southwestward was in part a reluctant nod to Terry's orders to continue scouting south along the trail from Rosebud westward to the Little Horn. Bentine and his trumpeter led the way on the left flank with our 3 troops following closely. Before long, Bentine called out to Lieutenant Gibson, who was temporarily in charge of my own troop, H. He instructed Gibson to take a couple of men and scout ahead. Bentine was riding roughly 100 yards ahead of the battalion, while Lieutenant Gibson moved even further, about a quarter mile out in front. The terrain we were crossing was rugged and rolling, making it tough on the horses. Each time Lieutenant Gibson reached a new hilltop, he signaled back that there were still no signs of any Indians. To us troopers in the ranks, it felt like we were chasing shadows. Before long, we veered off to the right, heading towards the trail that Custer and Reno had taken on their march westward to the Little Big Horn. For nearly 2 hours, we trudged up and down those rugged hills before eventually returning to the Custer Trail. I'd estimate we covered around 7 or 8 miles, which might not sound like much, but the difficult terrain made every mile feel longer. When we finally reached a small valley, we were all relieved. We followed the well-marked trail for 2 or 3 miles, Shod cavalry horses had torn up the grass enough that anyone could track them, until we arrived at the headwaters of a small stream flowing west. Like many such places, it was marshy, so we paused to let the horses drink in small groups. They hadn't had water since the previous afternoon, so it took a few minutes. Once they were watered, we continued down the tiny creek, moving westward. I remember noticing the lead pack mules rushing towards the marshy area just as we were moving out. A few of them lost control, driven by thirst, and ended up stuck in the bog. The slow pace of the pack train was unmistakable. Despite having been on a challenging scouting mission through the southern hills for hours, we still arrived at this point on the Custer-Reno trail ahead of the pack mules. To be fair, these weren't trained pack mules, but were instead animals from wagon teams. Many had been poorly loaded, had sore backs, and were clearly exhausted, having gone almost 24 hours without water. Just as we were leaving the waterhole, we began hearing gunfire up ahead. Captain Weir led his company forward, even though he was supposed to be second in line. Bentine, however, was already 100 yards ahead of him. We all sensed that a fight was imminent. Not long after leaving the swampy area, we came across a burning teepee. Known as the Lone Teepee, it marked the resting place of Old She-Bear, a Sioux warrior fatally wounded in the Battle of the Rosebud 8 days earlier. Custer's troops had set it aflame, and this had led to a tense moment between Custer and his scouts, with Custer reportedly threatening to make a woman of anyone who lagged, as recounted by Arikara scout Red Bear. Some thought the fire had been started by our Indian scouts with Custer or Reno, but Crow scout White Man Runs Him firmly denied it, insisting the soldiers had done it. We were now trotting at a brisk pace, the energy high with anticipation. Horses, just like men, can sense approaching danger, and many of the mounts were ready to bolt, despite their fatigue. Around this time, we spotted a trooper approaching us at a quick trot. It was Sergeant Canepe from Tom Custer's C Troop. He brought an order from General Custer instructing Captain McDougal to head across the terrain quickly and bring the pack mules up as fast as possible. Canepe relayed his orders to Bentine, who directed him back down the trail where the pack train was. As Canepe trotted past, he waved and shouted something about the Indians being on the run. We hadn't traveled much farther when we spotted a second figure in uniform riding toward us. It was Trumpeter Martini, Giovanni Martini, also known as John Martin, from my company assigned earlier that morning as General Custer's special orderly trumpeter. Later, I learned he was carrying a message from Custer to Bentine, hastily written on a field order pad and signed by Lieutenant Cook, the adjutant. The note read, "Bentine, come on. Big village. Be quick. Bring packs. P.S. Bring pack W. Cook." Martini was a spirited little Italian who'd once served as a drummer boy under Garibaldi in the Italian independence struggle. Captain Keogh, an Irishman commanding Troop I and riding with Custer that day, had also fought alongside Garibaldi. I knew Martini well because he was part of H. We used to tease him a lot, but after this fight, none of us did anymore. He proved his mettle that day. His horse had been struck in the right hip, blood flowing from a bullet wound, though Martini was entirely unaware. Bentine told him to rejoin his company. I always suspected that Bentine, knowing Sergeant Canepe, had already sent word to Captain McDougal to bring the pack train as quickly as possible, saw no need for further messages. Besides, Martini's horse was exhausted, and it took all he had just to keep up with us. The sound of heavy gunfire echoed through the air. Not long after, we encountered a few Crow or Ree scouts who were herding some Indian ponies. They yelled, "Soldiers!" and pointed toward the bluffs rising to the north. We immediately understood we were near the Little Bighorn Valley, where intense fighting was happening close by. Bentine gave the command to draw our pistols, and we charged up the bluffs at a gallop, bracing ourselves to meet hostiles at any moment. As we crested the first line of rolling hills, the river valley unfolded before us to our left, revealing a scene that could shake even the bravest of men. Below, around 150 feet down and about half a mile away, figures on horseback were galloping, gunfire erupting from every direction. Further down the river, we could make out a vast crowd of mounted men who we suspected were Indians. Our own pace was swift, and we had only a fleeting view of the chaos below before spotting soldiers, both on horseback and on foot, positioned on a hill to the north. We rode toward them with urgency. I should pause here to recount what I've learned happened to our comrades under Reno's command. Around 12:15 noon, Reno had been assigned 3 troops along with 17 Crow and Reese scouts and 3 white scouts. Custer led his 5 troops in a column on the right, while Reno was positioned on the left. Bentine, with his 3 troops, had orders to hunt the valley in the rough hills to the south and west. Since I was with Bentine, I didn't witness what happened to either Custer or Reno in those next 5 hours. But I've heard the tale, or rather many versions of it, so often that I'll do my best to recount it simply. Keep in mind, though, I wasn't there personally. This is the story as survivors shared it with me. As the 2 battalions began their descent along the dry creek bed toward the Little Bighorn Valley, they occasionally found themselves within 50 yards of each other, though at times they drifted as far as 200 yards apart. Together, they trotted westward, making their way toward the Little Bighorn. Around 2 p.m., the columns came upon a burning tepee containing the body of an Indian warrior named Old She-Bear, who had been killed a week earlier in General Crook's ill-fated skirmish with the Indians just under 20 miles away. Suddenly, one of the white scouts riding at the front called back to Custer, alerting him that a group of hostile Indians lay just ahead. These Indians showed no intention of engaging in battle, instead staying well out of rifle range. At this moment, Custer signaled to Major Reno, instructing him to cross the small creek they were following. He directed his adjutant, Cook, to relay orders to Reno to cross the Little Bighorn 2 miles further west, and upon doing so, to swing right and charge the Indian village, promising that the rest of the forces would back him up. This last directive would later become one of the most debated elements of the tragedy that was about to unfold. Leading his contingent of 120 men, along with guides and scouts, Reno pressed on at a swift trot. They crossed the ford of the Little Bighorn, taking only a brief pause to let their parched horses drink and to regroup on the west side in proper formation. According to Reno's own count, he had 112 men and officers of the 7th with me and some 25 scouts. This western side of the river opened into a relatively flat valley, approximately half a mile to a mile wide, stretching toward a low plateau to the west. On the opposite side, the east bank of the Little Bighorn was bordered by a range of hills, rising over 150 feet and forming what was known as the Wolf Mountains. At multiple points along these steep cliffs, coulees descended from the bluffs above to the river's edge below. During this season, the river flowed between 100 and 150 feet across, clear and cold over a gravelly bed. The west bank of the river, stretching nearly 3 miles, hosted a series of Indian camps. Each of the 5 Sioux or Dakota tribes, alongside the Cheyennes and smaller groups of Blackfeet and Arapahoes, had set up their own circular camps, spaced out by as much as a quarter mile. Further west, vast herds of ponies grazed under the watch of Indian boys and women. Altogether, it's estimated that a third of all Sioux tribespeople gathered here, possibly close to 10,000 of an estimated 30,000, which would mean between 2,000 and 3,000 warriors were present. This is an opportune moment to clarify a common misconception regarding the weaponry of the hostiles. Popular belief suggests that all the native warriors were equipped with the latest repeating Winchester rifles and ample ammunition. However, I believe that at least half of these warriors wielded only bows, arrows, and lances, and possibly half of the rest carried old muzzle-loaders or single-shot rifles of various makes. Likely no more than 25 to 30% had modern repeating rifles. Another point to note: Indian boys as young as 14 accompanied the warriors and actively participated, especially as the fighting wore on. The soldiers, meanwhile, carried single-shot 45 to 70 caliber Springfield carbines, a precise and lethal weapon at ranges up to 600 yards. However, when fired rapidly, these carbines often fouled and greasy cartridges could jam, rendering them impossible to eject with the extractor. In such cases, troopers had to use a hunting knife to force out the empty shell. This issue was, unfortunately, a significant cause of trooper casualties on that hot Sunday, and it may have indirectly contributed to the broader catastrophe. Each trooper was equipped with the latest model of the 6-shot, single-action Colt Army pistol. The soldiers had been ordered to carry 100 rounds of rifle ammunition and 24 rounds of pistol ammunition, either on their person or stored in their saddlebags. As the troops dismounted, with every fourth man assigned as a horse holder, many of the horses became spooked and ran off, causing thousands of rounds of much-needed ammunition to be lost, especially for Custer's men. Returning to Reno's actions, he had crossed the river and arranged his troops in a column formation, 4 abreast, with the Indian scouts positioned on his left flank. Soon, Indian horsemen were spotted racing back and forth across the valley, and the southern edge of the Indian camps came into view. Reno then deployed his 3 troops and scouts into a skirmish line that likely stretched across the full width of the narrow valley. They soon encountered intense, though erratic, gunfire from the Indians ahead, who were rapidly joined by hundreds of mounted warriors. During the skirmish, the horses of 3 troopers became uncontrollable, and they bolted directly toward the Indian lines. 2 of the men, G.H. Meyer and Roman Rutten, managed to turn their horses around, and despite being wounded, rejoined their comrades. Tragically, the 3rd trooper, G.E. Smith, continued straight into the Indian line, riding to his death. Seeing that his charge toward the Indian forces would likely end in catastrophe, Reno commanded his troops to dismount and prepare to fight on foot. Even before this order, numerous Indian warriors had already maneuvered southwest, pressing hard against the Crow and Ree scouts, forcing them to retreat. The situation grew grim for Reno, prompting him to order his skirmish lines to pull back toward a dense grove of cottonwood trees that followed a bend in the river and extended partway across the valley. The horses were led into the grove, while the thin line of soldiers held 3 sides of the position. With around 90 men, they were covering a line spanning 250 yards. Meanwhile, hundreds of mounted Indian warriors were closing in, half-circling the skirmish line, riding up close, firing from beneath their ponies' necks, and quickly retreating. Reno's men, now either firing from a prone position or using the bank of a dry creek bed as cover and support for their rifles, held their ground. In this repositioning, Sergeant O'Hara of Troop M was killed, the first soldier on the skirmish line to fall. Reno's location appeared somewhat defensible, leading some to believe that if he had pulled his men in and fortified his lines, he might have been able to hold out there for an extended period, at least as long as his ammunition held out. However, the intense yelling, relentless gunfire, thick smoke, swirling dust, and sheer fear clouded his judgment. Suddenly, Bloody Knife, Custer's favored scout, was shot through the head, splattering his brains over Reno. Shortly after, the Black Scout Dorman fell, followed by Charlie Reynolds, who was also struck fatally in the head. Realizing that their only chance lay in reaching high ground across the river, Reno shouted for his men to mount up in company formation. Amid the chaos and excitement, 2 troop commanders managed to get their men to mount and form a column of 4s. The 3rd troop, G, led by Lieutenant McIntosh, himself of partial Native American descent and an adopted son of General McIntosh, was stationed in the woods and did not receive the orders until the other 2 troops, with Reno at the lead, were already racing upstream in search of a river crossing. By this point, order and discipline had entirely disintegrated. Lieutenant McIntosh, after some struggle to organize his troopers into a rough column, finally emerged from the woods, lagging far behind the retreating troops. Amid this chaotic retreat, 19 men were left behind, among them Lieutenant Derudio and the White Scout Herndon. How anyone survived this frenzied retreat remains a mystery. All we know for certain is that the charging troops managed to break through a line of mounted native warriors, following a buffalo trail down to the river. There, they somehow succeeded in leaping their horses over a 4 or 5 foot embankment, plunging through the river, and scrambling up a narrow path carved into the steep hills to the east. Hundreds of native warriors fired wildly into the soldiers, gripped by panic, and it's remarkable that any troopers escaped this ordeal. No motion picture could ever capture the wild, chaotic throng of terrified men and horses. During the retreat, young Lieutenant Benny Hodgson was shot through the upper leg, and his horse was killed as he attempted to jump from the western bank of the river. Grabbing onto a fellow trooper's stirrup, he was dragged across the water, only to be struck down by a second bullet, just as he reached the safety of the east bank. In total, 26 troopers and scouts, along with 3 officers, lost their lives either in this desperate ride through the native gauntlet or at the edge of the woods. Of the 19 men initially left behind, 17 managed to cross the river and reach Reno Hill on foot within 2 hours. Lieutenant DeRudio and Private O'Neill did not rejoin us until 36 hours later, crossing right through the area where I was stationed on guard. By then, it was around 3:30 in the afternoon. Reno, visibly shaken and unnerved, had reached the hilltop, where his frightened troopers continued to gather. He was utterly defeated and in complete disarray. Remember, everything about Reno's battle in the valley comes from what I've been told. I didn't witness any of it firsthand. As I stood on the hilltop, trying to process the chaos of the retreat, my thoughts turned to the scattered soldiers around me and the grim question that lingered in every mind. Where was Custer in all of this? I'll never forget that first sight of the hilltop. There was a small cluster of men in blue uniforms, forming a skirmish line, while their beaten comrades, disorganized and terror-stricken, were struggling their way up the narrow coulee that led from the river, a full 150 feet below. Among them, we could make out Major Reno and Lieutenant Varnum. Both looked the worse for wear. I believe they had lost their hats, now resorting to handkerchiefs tied around their heads to shield themselves from the relentless Montana sun. I remember seeing Lieutenant Varnum reach up to shake hands with Lieutenant Godfrey of K Troop, who was his regular company commander. I overheard Varnum say something about the rough fight they had endured and that they had taken a damn good licking. There was no point in pretending. The men on the hill, from Reno down, were thoroughly disorganized and visibly shaken. They had lost many of their men, and it was nothing short of God's grace and the fortunate bad aim of their enemies that had allowed them to make it across the river alive. Yet even now, their safety was uncertain. Hundreds of native warriors still occupied the valley below, roughly a half-mile from where we stood, firing at those soldiers who were still attempting to cross the river and join our small force on the hilltop. Each shot was a reminder of how close our fate had come. At this moment, Bentine, with his calm and capable presence, more or less took command. Major Reno had just endured an ordeal beyond words, and for now, he seemed relieved to let his junior officer step in and take charge. The hilltop felt like both a haven and a trap. We were surrounded by the vastness of the land and the uncertainty of what might come next. The question that hung in the air among the men was unavoidable. Where was Custer? Bentine quickly dismounted his 3 troops and directed us to form a skirmish line. Reno's men had nearly exhausted their ammunition, so we were instructed to share ours with them. Bentine's force of 120 men was still intact, and around 60 of Reno's men from the valley fight remained with us. Barely able to stretch our legs after the long hours in the saddle, we were all asking, "Where's Custer?" Officers and soldiers alike were puzzling over the mystery. What had happened to Custer and his 5 companies? Trumpeter Martini, who had returned with the last message urging Bentine to advance quickly with the packs, informed us that Custer had ridden northward over the rolling hills east of the Little Bighorn. Some of Reno's men recounted, with some excitement, that they had spotted Captain Yates's troop with white horses on a bluff on our side of the river, possibly about a mile to the north. Others claimed they had glimpsed Custer and a couple of men surveying the scene from a hilltop. Martini estimated it was perhaps another mile downstream, northward from our position, where he had been instructed to relay his message to Bentine. It seemed that Custer was now much farther to the north, likely in the midst of fierce combat, but no one knew for sure. All we understood was that he and almost half the regiment had vanished. By fortune, we had arrived just in time to prevent what might have been total disaster for Reno. From our position on Reno Hill, spread out in a circular skirmish line, we could see the valley below. The scene was chaotic. Some of our soldiers were still being picked off by the encircling Indian forces. There were gunshots, clouds of dust, and fierce cries, until suddenly the majority of the Indians began riding swiftly downstream toward the north. Not long after, we started to hear intense gunfire from that direction. Reno, Bentine, and a few other officers held a quick conference. Then, Lieutenant Hare, who had managed Reno's Indian scouts, suddenly mounted Godfrey's horse and rode south along our trail. After about 15 or 20 minutes, possibly closer to half an hour, he returned at a steady trot with several pack mules loaded with ammunition boxes. Soon, the rest of the dozen ammunition mules arrived, followed by the entire pack train. Now we had 24,000 rounds of rifle ammunition, provisions, and reinforcements totaling at least 130 armed men. Aside from an occasional distant shot, the firing near us had stopped. The Indians seemed to have moved northward. We could hear the muffled sound of gunfire echoing through the hills and valleys from that direction. Custer had to be down there. By around 4:30, with the sun still fairly high, we troopers were left guessing about what was unfolding. Suddenly, I saw Captain Weir ride off north alone, and a minute later, Lieutenant Edgerly, second in command of D Troop, followed him with the whole unit. Just then, the pack mules were arriving, and speculation was running high among us. As I remember, Reno had 7 wounded men, some in quite severe condition. But in total, he now commanded around 310 effective soldiers, just a bit over half the regiment's original strength. Custer had approximately 220 men with him. In such conditions, estimating time is difficult, but in reflecting on it over the years, I'd say it was around 5 when Reno and Bentine gave the order for the entire group to move north, in the general direction where Captain Weir and D Troop had gone about half an hour earlier. Wounded soldiers who could ride were mounted on horses, while others had to be carried in blankets by 6 troopers on foot, making for a slow and grueling process. I've often thought most of the officers questioned the wisdom of this decision. We hadn't gone more than a mile when Weir's troop came into view. Far to the north, we could see what appeared to be clusters of mounted Indians, with plenty of gunfire echoing across the plains. Soon, it became clear the Indian forces were indeed advancing towards us. We were stretched thinly across a wide area, with one troop positioned on a hill, another in a small valley, and a third further off. Meanwhile, the packed trains, the wounded, and the rear guard followed behind at a slow pace. Both Reno and Bentine sensed the impending danger and ordered a retreat. The leading troops dismounted to fight as skirmishers. The Indians pressed in hard, and only through sheer luck and the tenacious courage of Lieutenant Godfrey's troop, which fought determinedly on foot, did we avoid disaster. We managed to fall back to Reno's hill, where Troop K held off the Indians long enough for the rest of us to reach the hilltop and make a final dash for safety. By now, it was probably around 6:30 in the afternoon, with roughly 3 hours of daylight remaining. Reno, with Bentine by his side offering advice, quickly organized the forces in anticipation of the next attack. In a slight depression at the center, horses and mules were staked out and a small field hospital was set up. However, we couldn't shield the men or animals from the Indians firing from a hilltop to the east. One animal after another fell, and men were being hit. It was tough, seeing all this unfold and being unable to do much about it. Our Troop H was stationed to the south in a perilous spot, right by the river, with higher ground looming behind us. We were just as defenseless against enemy fire as the injured men and animals around us. But still unaware of the full danger we faced, we scrambled to build whatever makeshift barricades we could gather. We used pack saddles, boxes of hardtack, slabs of bacon, anything we could get our hands on. None of it was real protection, but it gave us a sense of security. We'd barely settled into our skirmish line, with H-men positioned about 20 feet apart, when the Indians nearly encircled us, and the fight truly began. There was no grand charge, but small groups of Indians crept as close as they dared, opening fire from behind bushes or little knolls. They used every trick in the book to draw our shots. Sometimes a naked warrior would suddenly leap up, and as soon as we took aim, he'd fling himself down. Other times they'd flash a blanket or a headdress to lure us into firing. It wasn't long before we learned to resist. I often thought that if the Indians had coordinated a charge from all directions, they could have overwhelmed us. But they didn't. Each man fought his own way. An Indian was prouder if he could count coup, touch an enemy with his long coop stick, than if he killed one. At one point, A warrior darted close to our lines to touch one of our fallen with his coup stick, and we filled him with lead before he could escape. By then, the Indians were pressing hard on H, and we were in serious danger of being overrun. The sun sank that evening like a blazing sphere. Before long, the swift twilight of Montana settled over us, followed by the biting cold of the high plains. There was no moon, and never before had we been so grateful for the cover of darkness. Gradually, the gunfire faded. Occasionally, we still heard the ping of a distant rifle shot, but by 10 o'clock, even that had ceased. Yet, as welcome as the nightfall was, it brought a gnawing sense of fear and uncertainty about what awaited us come morning. We felt utterly isolated on that perilous hilltop, as if marooned a million miles from anywhere, surrounded by the ever-present specter of death. Across the river, down in the Little Horn Valley, where the bodies of so many of our fallen comrades lay, we could see large fires blazing and hear the steady, ominous beat of Indian drums as they celebrated their victory with wild dances. It seemed that the Indians had triumphed everywhere on that fateful Sabbath. Every so often, a high-pitched wail would pierce the night, likely the mourning of the women, crying out to the Great Spirits for their lost warriors. Throughout that short, pitch-black night, the eerie celebration continued below in the river valley, filling our hearts with dread. The mystery surrounding Custer's fate chilled our blood each time we pondered it. Where was Custer? What had happened to him? Surely, he must have suffered some defeat, and then moved down the stream toward the confluence of the Little and Big Horn. Gibbon's column, along with General Terry, would soon arrive there. Could Custer have reached safety, along with whatever remained of his 5 troops who managed to escape the battle that had raged 3 miles to the north of our position? They couldn't all have perished. Not lucky Custer and those 5 brave troops with him. Why had he left us behind? During those 3 brutal hours before the darkness had saved us, we had lost no fewer than 12 men, with 3 times as many wounded. Throughout the short night, their cries for water echoed around us. Reaching the river was out of the question, even under cover of darkness. It would have been suicide. We were busy, scraping out shallow holes with our mess kits, steel knives, forks, and even our bare hands. We could not face the light of day without some measure of protection, however minimal. It was painfully inadequate, yet it was something. To the east, streaks of pink and yellow began to color the sky. Dawn was breaking. 2 shots rang out from the hilltop behind us. Soon gunfire erupted all around. The night had brought a light rain, and some of us had pulled our overcoats from the cantles of our McClellan saddles to keep warm. Standing on that barren hilltop, the chill was biting, but those old army bluecoats provided much-needed warmth. Beside me lay my companion, a young fellow named Jones from Milwaukee. Together, we had dug a shallow trench, piling up dirt to form a small breastwork for cover. Dawn had fully broken, and sharpshooters positioned on a hill to the south, about 1,000 yards away, were taking shots at us. Jones mentioned wanting to take off his overcoat, and he began to roll onto his side to remove it without exposing himself. Suddenly, I heard him cry out. A bullet had struck him right through the heart. Bullets continued to spit around me as I lay there. I could make out a figure on the hilltop aiming at me from a prone position, his rifle resting on what looked like a bleached buffalo skull. I tried to return fire with my Springfield carbine, but it simply couldn't reach that far. Just minutes after Jones had been hit, a bullet ricocheted off the hard ground and tore into my clothing. Around that time, the surgeon arrived to check on Jones. He asked if I was wounded, to which I replied that I was fine. "Put your hand inside your shirt," he instructed. When I pulled my hand back, it was covered in blood. A ricocheted bullet had given me a light flesh wound. The surgeon wanted to bandage it up, but I told him to tend to the more seriously wounded first. Moments later, another bullet from the hill struck the hickory butt of my rifle, splitting it cleanly in 2. Frustrated, I realized I couldn't retaliate effectively with my army carbine. I couldn't shake the feeling that the sharpshooter who killed Jones, injured me, and destroyed my rifle butt was either a renegade white man or a squaw man of some sort. His accuracy was too precise to be the work of a full-blooded Indian. Around this time, the 30 or 40 wounded men among us began to cry out desperately for water. H Troop was stationed on a hill at the southwestern side. There was a ravine that sloped down the west side of the hill towards the river. The path was treacherous and open, making it almost certain that anyone who attempted to reach the river along that route would be killed. Concealed across the river, Native American warriors were firing up at us, covering every inch of that ravine in the riverbank. But we couldn't ignore the pleas of our wounded comrades. We had to try something. Eventually, Captain Bentine called for volunteers. I believe about 17 of us stepped forward. He chose 4 of us from H Troop, each known for accurate shooting, to take an exposed position at the edge of the hill overlooking the river. Our task was to stand tall and not only attract the fire of the warriors below, but also to unleash as many shots as we could into the bushes where they were hiding. This diversion would give the water party a chance to descend the ravine, fill their buckets, pots, and canteens, and then make their way back. It so happened that the 4 men assigned to hold the hill were all German boys: Geiger, Meckling, Voigt, and me. Although we were completely exposed on that ridge for over 20 minutes, with bullets flying thick around us, none of us was wounded. Some of the water party, however, were severely injured, despite our continuous cover fire into the bushes. Each of us received a Congressional Medal of Honor. But truth be told, many brave men who deserved medals that day didn't receive them. Sometimes, the men who most deserve recognition go unnoticed, either because no officer saw their brave actions or because a recommendation wasn't submitted. Many men that day were deserving of the highest honors for their courage. Sergeant Paul, for example, led a charge later on that morning. Then there were Crazy Jim Sivers, Dan Newell, Sliper, and others. Personally, I received more credit than I felt I deserved. After we had returned with water for the wounded, Bentine informed me that he was promoting me to sergeant right there on the battlefield, a moment of immense pride for me. Speaking of that charge, at one point that morning, the Native American forces began pressing us hard. H Troop was more exposed than any of the others, and it looked like the hostiles were preparing for a sudden, concentrated assault. Bentine walked up and down the line, urging us to hold our positions, conserve our ammunition, and remain steady. I recall saying to him, "Colonel, you better get down, sir, or you'll get killed." "Don't worry about me," he replied with a grim expression. "I'm all right." He certainly seemed to have a stroke of luck protecting him that day. But things looked grim. Eventually, Bentine rushed over to the north side of our line to speak with Major Reno, urgently requesting reinforcements. He warned Reno that the Indians were preparing to charge, and if they managed to overrun the line, the entire unit would be wiped out. Reno instructed him to gather as many men from M Troop as he could. The sight of those men was a great relief to us. Not long after, Captain Bentine led the counterattack. With shouts and gunfire, we moved forward at a double-quick pace, and the Indians broke and scattered. After pushing them back 100 yards, we quickly returned to our positions. We settled back in, bracing ourselves for the incoming fire, with casualties among our men now occurring at intervals, and the horses and mules suffering terribly in the hollow where they were gathered. Around this time, Bentine called me over, put me at attention, and promoted me to sergeant. By then, H Troop had already lost a sergeant and 2 men, with 12 more wounded. I suppose it was early afternoon when the gunfire finally seemed to diminish. Occasionally, bullets still tore past us, but they became less frequent as time passed. Then across the Little Horn we noticed heavy smoke drifting southward. Soon it became apparent that the Indians were setting the grass on fire, which struck us as strange, unless they were preparing to withdraw. With the gunfire nearly ceased, some of us left our trenches, gathering in small clusters along the brow of the hill. What happened next will stay with me as long as I live. The thick smoke lifted momentarily, revealing a sight below us, a vast procession of Indians on foot and horseback, accompanied by their pony herds, travois, dogs, pack animals, and all the belongings of an immense camp, all moving southward. It was like a scene from the Bible, reminiscent of the Israelites journeying into Egypt, a great tribe on the move. At first, we believed it might be a trick, that the Indians were merely moving their families to safety, and that their warriors would soon return to overwhelm us. We waited patiently in our small trenches as the long June afternoon crept by. The shooting had nearly stopped, the smoke in the valley had drifted away, and the last of the Indians had vanished. While guards remained vigilant, the rest of the men led the surviving horses down the steep paths to the river. It was their first drink since early afternoon the previous day. With care, we buried our dead in the shallow trenches we had initially dug for ourselves. Reno then commanded the entire camp to move as close to the river as possible. We wanted to distance ourselves from the unbearable stench. Now, there was finally plenty of water for the wounded, and by evening, the company cooks prepared the best meal they could manage. At last, we had hot coffee, a good helping of bacon, and soaked hardtack. It was our first meal in 36 hours. As night fell, we were exhausted, yet while the guards kept watch, the rest of us drifted into a fitful sleep. Still, there was no word from Custer. A sense of dread began to settle over us, and we feared that some tragic fate might have befallen him. We could only imagine what that might be. As darkness settled over the hilltop, we lay drained, worn from the relentless hours of combat, and unsettled by the silence that followed. The valley below, once resounding with the roar of gunfire, now rested quietly beneath the shroud of night. Under the somber Montana sky, we gathered close, troubled by thoughts of our fallen comrades, while the fate of General Custer loomed as an unsettling enigma. Without word of his condition, we could only hope that he and his men had found safety, though deep down, our fears painted a grim picture. Encircled by the prairie's stillness, we faced the sobering truth that the price of this struggle had exceeded all expectations. Yet, as dawn threatened to unveil fresh conflict, we understood that our duty was far from complete. The steady rhythm of distant drums reverberated through the night, a stark reminder that survival on this unforgiving terrain would demand an immense cost.